Somewhere in eastern Lebanon, up in the Bekaa Valley, about 1,000 meters above sea level, there's a place that makes engineers go quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get when something is beautiful, though it is. The kind of quiet you get when you're looking at something that shouldn't be possible and you know it. It's called Baalbek. And if you could stand there tonight in the dark, with the floodlights off and just the moon overhead, you would feel it immediately. A weight to the air, a scale to things that doesn't match the world you walked in from. The columns alone are taller than a 5-story building. The platform they stand on is older than the empire that built most of what you can see. And somewhere beneath your feet, locked into the foundation like the bottom card in a house of cards, are 3 stone blocks that each weigh somewhere between 800 and 1,000 tons, each one. And nearby, still sitting in the quarry it was cut from, there's a stone that hasn't moved in roughly 2,000 years. It weighs somewhere around 1,650 tons. Some estimates push it even higher. Nobody ever moved it. Nobody ever figured out how. That's where we're starting tonight. Now, if you're listening to this to fall asleep, that is exactly what this channel is for, so welcome. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. I read those comments, and every time it's the same thing. Tokyo at 2 a.m, Texas at 11, someone in Auckland just getting into bed. It genuinely never gets old. So, Baalbek. Here's the thing about this place that most people get wrong before they even start. The mystery isn't just who built it. The Romans built most of what's standing. We know that. The question that actually keeps archaeologists and engineers up at night is how? How did knowledge, logistics, ambition, and raw physical capability accumulate in one place, to the point where moving a 1,000-ton block of limestone became something someone looked at and said, yes, we can do that. That's the question we're going to follow all the way through tonight. Not ancient aliens, not lost civilizations with technology we've somehow forgotten. The real story, which is, in its own way, stranger and more impressive than any of those. What archaeology can say with confidence is considerable. What remains genuinely debated, even among serious researchers, is also considerable. We're going to be honest about where the line is between those two things, because the stones at Baalbek deserve that honesty. They are real, they are there, and after 2,000 years they are still waiting for a complete explanation. Let's go find one. To understand why Baalbek became what it became, you have to start with the ground it sits on. Not the platform, not the stones, not the columns, the actual geography. Because places like this don't become sacred or strategic or legendary by accident. They become those things because the land itself makes them inevitable. The Bekaa Valley runs roughly north to south through what is now eastern Lebanon, wedged between 2 mountain ranges that run parallel like the sides of a long corridor. To the west, the Lebanon Mountains. To the east, the Anti-Lebanon Range, with Mount Hermon anchoring the southern end. The valley floor sits about 1,000 meters above sea level, which sounds high, but it's relatively flat, relatively fertile, and critically, it's one of the few places in this entire region where the land actually lets you move. East to west, the mountains are walls, but through the Bekaa you can travel. North toward Syria and Mesopotamia, south toward Canaan and Egypt. It is, in every meaningful sense, a natural highway through otherwise difficult terrain. Baalbek sits almost exactly in the middle of that corridor. This matters more than almost any other single fact about the site. Armies move through the Bekaa Valley. Trade caravans move through the Bekaa Valley. Ideas move through the Bekaa Valley. And wherever those things converge over long enough periods of time, something gets built to mark the crossing. Sometimes it's a fort, sometimes it's a market town, and sometimes, when the people passing through are looking for something to explain the forces that seem to govern their lives, it becomes a sanctuary. The valley also has water. The Litani River runs through it, and there are springs that would have made the area viable for permanent settlement, going back thousands of years before anyone was keeping written records. Fertile ground, reliable water, and a position at the crossroads of ancient Near Eastern trade routes. You almost didn't need to choose to build here. The place chose you. Now, the name. This is where it gets interesting. Because Baalbek carries at least 2,000 years of naming history layered inside it like geological strata. And each layer tells you something about who was in charge at the time and what they wanted the place to mean. The oldest name we have reasonable confidence in is Baalbek itself, or some close variation of it. The first part, Baal, comes from the Semitic word for lord, or master, and was the title given to any number of regional storm and fertility deities across the ancient Near East. It's the same root that shows up in the Hebrew Bible, in Phoenician inscriptions, in Canaanite religious texts. Baal wasn't a single god with a fixed identity. It was more like a title, a designation, applied to the dominant divine power recognized in a particular place. The second part, Bek, is less certain. Some scholars connect it to a local geographic feature, possibly a spring or a watercourse. Others link it to a personal name or a local Semitic root meaning valley or hollow. The etymology is genuinely debated, and anyone who tells you they know for certain is probably oversimplifying. What it almost certainly indicates, in some combination of meanings, is the place of Baal, the Lord's domain, a site already recognized as sacred long before any army arrived to claim it. Then the Greeks arrived, and with them came the renaming that the Romans would inherit and amplify. They called it Heliopolis, City of the Sun. It was a translation, or at least a reinterpretation. The local deity being worshipped at Baalbek was associated, in the Greek and later Roman mind, with solar divinity, and so the place became a sun city, and aligned in their religious imagination with Heliopolis in Egypt, that ancient centre of solar worship on the Nile. The name Heliopolis was both a recognition of existing local tradition and a rebranding of it. Here is your god, the Romans were effectively saying, but now he belongs to our imperial pantheon too. The coexistence of these two names, Baalbek and Heliopolis, running side by side through history, is itself a kind of fingerprint. It tells you that no single culture ever fully erased what came before. The Semitic name persisted because the local population persisted. The Greek name spread because political power spread. When the Arab conquest came centuries later, the older name reasserted itself, and Baalbek is what it has been called ever since. Names are rarely just labels. They're records of who won, who lost, and who refused to entirely disappear. What all of this points to is something archaeologists describe when they call a site a palimpsest. A palimpsest is an old manuscript that's been scraped clean and written on again. Except the old writing never quite disappears. You can still read the layers underneath if you look carefully enough. Baalbek is exactly that. Every generation of builders arrived at a place that already had meaning, already had history, already had a claim on the local imagination. And so they didn't start from nothing. They built on top, or alongside, or in deliberate conversation with what was already there. This is how major sanctuaries tend to work, actually. The places that attract the most ambitious construction over the longest periods aren't chosen arbitrarily. They accumulate. A spring or a hilltop or a crossroads becomes a local sacred spot, then a regional one, then something larger powers decide is worth claiming for themselves. The scale grows not because a single empire decides to build something enormous, but because generation after generation of different people, for different reasons, all independently arrive at the conclusion that this particular piece of ground is worth the effort. Baalbek is a place where that process ran for an extraordinarily long time. By the time Roman engineers were eyeing those limestone quarries and starting to sketch out what would become one of the largest religious complexes in the ancient world, they were arriving at a location that had probably been considered sacred for 1,000 years or more. They were the latest builders, not the first. And beneath everything they raised, the older layers were still there waiting to be read. That's the frame for everything else we're going to talk about tonight. Not a single moment of construction, a long, slow accumulation of significance, carried forward by trade and faith and political ambition across centuries. The stones are extraordinary. But they didn't appear in a vacuum. Someone was here first. Someone was here first. But figuring out exactly who and what they believed and what they built is one of the harder problems in the entire Baalbek story. Because the Romans were thorough. When they decided to build on a colossal scale, they didn't carefully preserve the earlier layers for future archaeologists. They buried them, reshaped them, just built over them with foundations so massive that reaching what's underneath requires moving things that weigh hundreds of tons. So what we know about pre-Roman Baalbek is partial, cautious, and shot through with interpretive gaps that honest scholars are the first to acknowledge. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this. The Bekaa Valley was inhabited continuously for thousands of years before Rome arrived. Archaeological surveys of the broader region have turned up evidence of Bronze Age settlement, pottery sherds, traces of occupation that push back well into the 2nd millennium BCE, possibly earlier. People were living here. They were farming the fertile valley floor. They were moving along those trade routes that made the region so strategically valuable. And in the religious world of the ancient Near East, where communities that farmed and traded didn't separate their practical concerns from their sacred ones, the gods who mattered were the gods who controlled rain, harvest, and the forces that made survival possible or impossible. Which brings us to Baal. Not a single god, remember, a title, a designation for the dominant divine power of a place, most commonly associated with storms, rain, and the fertility that follows from both. In the specific tradition that archaeologists and historians connect to this part of the Levant, Baal is often identified with Hadad, the storm deity, whose thunderclaps were understood as divine speech, and whose reign was the literal difference between a good harvest and starvation. Hadad was worshipped across a vast stretch of the ancient Near East, from Mesopotamia down through Syria and into Canaan. He appears in texts, in personal names, in the iconography of temples across the region. He was often depicted holding a lightning bolt or standing on a bull, symbols of power over the sky and the land beneath it. Now look at the Bekaa Valley again, 1,000 meters above sea level, flanked by mountains that catch moisture from the Mediterranean and can dump it as rain or snow. A valley where the difference between a wet spring and a dry one would have meant the difference between enough food and not enough. If you lived here, you watched the sky. You read the clouds building over the Lebanon mountains. You waited for the storms to break. And you probably believed, as almost every agricultural society in the ancient world believed, that someone out there was deciding whether those storms came or didn't. Baal-Hadad made perfect sense here. The landscape almost demanded him. The Phoenicians, who became the dominant cultural and commercial power along the Levantine coast through the 1st millennium BCE, carried versions of these storm deity traditions with them wherever their trade networks reached. Phoenician religion wasn't a single unified system, any more than Baal was a single unified figure. It was a family of related practices, local variations on shared themes, adapted to the needs and the geography of individual communities. In the Bekaa Valley, positioned as it was between the Phoenician coastal cities and the interior kingdoms of Syria, those traditions would have layered over and intermingled with whatever had come before. But here is where honesty requires a pause. We don't have abundant early inscriptions from Baalbek itself. We don't have detailed temple records or foundation texts from the pre-Roman sanctuary, if a formal sanctuary even existed in the way we might imagine one. The evidence is fragmentary, inferential, built from regional patterns rather than direct documentation. Later writers mention the antiquity of the site's sacred character. Archaeological work has found traces of earlier activity beneath and around the Roman complex. But the specific form that pre-Roman worship took at this exact location, what structures existed, how they were organized, what rituals were practiced, most of that remains genuinely uncertain. Anyone presenting a confident, detailed picture of the pre-Roman sanctuary at Baalbek is filling in gaps with imagination. What is less uncertain is the broader principle, one that holds across dozens of sacred sites in the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. Sacred places persist, not because they're protected, but because the logic that made them sacred in the first place keeps reasserting itself. The spring is still there, the crossroads is still there, the view of the sky that made this particular hilltop feel closer to the divine is still there. New people arrive with new names for the gods, and they look at the place and they recognize something, even if they can't fully articulate what. And so they build, or they adapt, or they simply continue. This is the phenomenon that sets up the deepest question in the entire Baalbek story. When the Romans arrived, probably sometime in the 1st century BCE and increasingly through the 1st century CE, and began planning what would become one of the most ambitious religious construction projects in the ancient world, what did they find on that ground? Was there an existing platform, a prepared surface, an earlier terrace that their engineers incorporated rather than replaced? Could some of the choices made about scale, orientation, and foundation design reflect decisions made long before any Roman surveyor set foot in the Bekaa Valley? We don't know. Not definitively. The evidence is buried under Roman stonework of almost incomprehensible mass. But the question is real, and serious researchers take it seriously, and it means that when we finally get to those 3 enormous blocks sitting in the podium wall, we can't assume we know exactly whose hands first decided they needed to be there. The Romans built something extraordinary at Baalbek, but they may not have built it on empty ground. When Rome finally shows up in this story, it doesn't tiptoe. By the late 1st century BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean had gone from a patchwork of Hellenistic kingdoms and local dynasties to something much simpler, at least on a map. Roman provinces, Syria, Phoenicia, Judea, the interior highlands, they were now being threaded into a single imperial fabric. And Rome, unlike the small kingdoms it replaced, had a particular way of announcing itself. It didn't just send soldiers and tax collectors, it sent stone. Across the empire, from Britain to the Euphrates, Rome expressed power in a very specific architectural language. Forums, theatres, baths, and above all temples. Not just little local shrines, but monumental sanctuaries that fused Roman engineering with local religious traditions. These places did multiple jobs at once. They honoured the gods, they impressed the locals, they gave elites somewhere to display loyalty and wealth. And they reminded everyone, quietly but constantly, who was in charge. The Bekaa Valley sat right in the middle of a zone that mattered. It was a corridor between the coast and the interior, between places like Tyre and Sidon on one side, and Damascus and the Syrian steppe on the other. Under Rome, that meant troops moving, grain moving, goods moving, taxes moving. An ideal place, from an imperial perspective, to anchor a statement. Rome is here. Rome is permanent. Rome is bigger than whatever was here before. In Roman terms, that statement takes the form of a new name, Heliopolis, City of the Sun, a Greek name used under Roman rule layered over an older Semitic toponym that survives as Baalbek. Already you can hear the fusion. Baal, the old storm lord of the region, Helios, the sun, Jupiter, the Roman sky father, cosmology and politics braided together. The centerpiece of that new Heliopolis would be a temple complex on a scale that even Romans regarded as exceptional, the sanctuary of Jupiter. Today, When we talk about the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek, it's easy to imagine a single building. But what rose here under the empire was more like a vast religious city inside the city. An axial progression of spaces, an enormous forecourt, an intricately designed hexagonal court added later, a grand colonnaded courtyard, and finally the great temple itself on its massive podium. Around this spine grew altars, subsidiary chapels, stairways, monumental gateways, porticos. It was a sacred machine designed to process bodies and minds, leading you inward, upward, toward the god. Functionally, it was never just about worship. In the Roman world, big sanctuaries at strategic crossroads doubled as civic centres. They hosted festivals that drew attendees from days away. They provided a stage where local elites could sponsor games, feasts, processions, conspicuous generosity that helped cement their status. They served as economic hubs, markets around the sanctuary, pilgrims paying for sacrifices, lodging, animals, food. They were also political theatres. Statues of emperors and governors stood in these courts. Imperial decrees might be posted on their walls. Loyalty to the gods of Rome and to the emperor could be performed visibly in stone-framed space. At Heliopolis, this role seems to have been amplified. Inscriptions from the Roman period describe the city as a colonia, a settlement with special legal status, populated partly by veterans and people with Roman citizenship. This wasn't just a provincial town with a temple, it was a little piece of Rome planted in the Levant, and its sanctuary was a flagship project. Projects like this didn't just happen because someone had a vision. They were organised, and Roman construction, especially at this scale, was a hierarchy on legs. At the top there was patronage. In some cities, the emperor himself initiated a major temple. In others, a governor or a powerful local family took the lead, hoping to curry imperial favour. At Heliopolis, different phases of construction likely reflect different waves of funding. Early foundations in the late Republic or early Empire, expansions under emperors like Augustus, Nero, or later Severan rulers, who took a particular interest in Eastern cults. Inscriptions from the site point to emperors and local notables contributing to specific parts, columns, gateways, altars. Beneath the patrons, there were the minds, architects and engineers. These weren't lone geniuses sketching on parchment. They were trained specialists in survey, geometry, load distribution and logistics. When they arrived at Baalbek, they would have walked the hill, taken bearings, sighted lines with grommet, surveying instruments, and set out the orientation of the complex with reference to cardinal directions and perhaps to existing sacred markers. They had to negotiate with what was already there, the earlier sanctuary, the bedrock, the slope, the water flow. At some point, someone decided not just to build a big temple, but to raise it on a podium so massive that its foundations would merge with the hill itself. Then came the technical middle layer. Surveyors marking out quarries and roadways, foremen overseeing teams of masons, carpenters and metal workers, specialized artisans carving capitals and friezes, scribes tracking expenses, rations and labor rosters. Roman building was bureaucratic. Stones did not move without someone counting them, and at the base of this pyramid were the actual hands, thousands of them, over generations. Local villagers hired seasonally, permanent urban work crews, skilled stonemasons whose craft had been passed down for centuries in the Levant, possibly prisoners of war and enslaved labourers doing the hardest, least skilled tasks, dragging stone, mixing mortar, clearing debris. Roman armies also came with military engineers and soldiers trained in construction. In frontier zones, legions routinely built roads, bridges and fortifications. At a place like Baalbek, they may have contributed to heavy lift operations and earthworks. When you look at the remains today, you can see clear fingerprints of this Roman machine. The Corinthian columns of the Jupiter temple, the few that still rise, are textbook-high imperial Rome. Tall, fluted shafts, ornate capitals with acanthus leaves curling outward, entablatures carved with garlands, bacrania, and classical mouldings. The layout of colonnaded courts, the monumental stairs, the triumphal gateway with its elaborate decoration, all of this speaks the same language you hear in temples from Rome to North Africa. The use of drafted margin ashlar blocks, large stones with smooth centres and a raised chiselled border, is a very standard Roman technique. The way walls bond at the corners, the patterns of clamp holes and dowel sockets used to hold blocks together, the careful alternation of courses to distribute weight. These are all familiar to anyone who has studied Roman imperial construction elsewhere. Decorative details tell the same story. Reliefs of eagles, wreaths, and classical vegetal motifs. Latin and Greek inscriptions naming emperors, local councils, benefactors. Architectural mouldings that belong firmly in the stylistic evolution of the 1st through 3rd centuries CE, not in some lost prehistory. But there are also elements that don't fit quite as neatly into the usual Roman box. And this is where the debates begin. The most obvious is scale. Roman temples could be big. The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus in Rome, the great sanctuaries at Pergamon, Gerasa, Palmyra, and Baetica, they're all impressive. But the podium at Heliopolis, especially with the inclusion of its truly colossal blocks, is extreme even by Roman standards. It looks less like a building foundation and more like an artificial mountain. Some scholars argue that this extremity was part of a deliberate strategy to graft Rome's chief sky god, Jupiter, onto a site already associated with a powerful local sky or storm deity. To say in stone that Jupiter wasn't just another god in a pantheon, but the culmination and conquest of an older sacred tradition. If the hill was already holy, Rome would make it holier, bigger, more architecturally unavoidable. Others point to construction details at the lowest courses of the podium and at the so-called Great Platform on the western side that look different from typical Roman work. Massive, irregularly sized stones fitted with tight joints. You have fewer clamps than you might expect, techniques that some see as echoing older, Near Eastern megalithic styles. This has led to competing hypotheses. One possibility is that Roman engineers incorporated an earlier monumental terrace, perhaps from a Hellenistic or even pre-Hellenistic phase. Another is that they were simply pushing known Roman methods to their practical and symbolic limits, borrowing and experimenting as they went. What's firmly Roman in style, then, are the visible temples, colonnades, courts, and decorative programs. What's more contested are the deepest layers of the podium, especially where the largest blocks are involved. Are we looking at continuous Roman work from top to bottom, executed in different phases with different teams and approaches? Or are we seeing a Roman superstructure resting, at least in part, on foundations whose origins stretch back into that poorly documented pre-Roman sacred landscape? There is one more question lurking underneath all of this. Why here? And why this big? Rome built many sanctuaries. It built none quite like Heliopolis. This was not the capital of a major province like Antioch or Alexandria. It wasn't a metropolis like Carthage or Ephesus. Yet its temple complex rivals, and in some ways surpasses, anything in those cities. Several explanations have been offered, none entirely definitive. Perhaps Heliopolis sat at the intersection of important trade and military routes, making it a natural gathering point for festivals that drew people from a wide region. Perhaps powerful local priestly families successfully persuaded Roman patrons to invest heavily, and turning their ancestral cult into a regional magnet under the Jupiter brand. Perhaps emperors with Eastern connections favoured this sanctuary as a symbolic anchor, a place where Rome could present itself as heir to ancient Semitic and Hellenistic religious traditions. Or perhaps the answer is simpler and more human. Imperial systems, like people, sometimes overdo things. An ambitious governor wants to leave a mark. A local elite family wants its hometown to outshine its rivals. An emperor in need of loyalty showers favours on a city that promises to be a beacon of Roman piety in a complex, sometimes restive region. Whatever the precise motive, the result was the same. By the time the major phases of construction were complete, Heliopolis was no longer just a hill with a long sacred history. It was one of the largest temple complexes in the entire Roman world, a fusion of empire and local tradition, of old gods and new names, of engineering pushed to the edge of what was thinkable. And within that fusion, built into its very foundations, sit those stones that refuse to be ignored, the ones that make you stop and ask, how exactly did they do that? If you walk around the western side of the great podium at Baalbek, past the fallen columns and the later walls, you eventually come to a stretch of masonry that doesn't quite look real. Most of the podium is made of big stones by any normal standard, blocks the size of cars, even buses, laid in regular courses. But then, partway up the face of the western wall, you hit a row of 3 blocks that break the scale of the human eye. These are the stones that people mean when they talk about the Trilithon. The word sounds exotic, but it just means 3 stones. In this case, 3 limestone blocks set side by side in a single course of the podium wall, about 2/3 of the way up on the outer western face of the great terrace that supports the Temple of Jupiter. Each one is roughly the size of a small house. Together they form a continuous band of masonry more than 60 meters long. They don't sit at ground level, where you could imagine rolling them in and leaving them there. They're elevated, resting on top of other large blocks and in turn carrying additional courses of stone above them. They're not decorative, not a facade tacked on afterward. They are integral, they're in the wall, part of its structural fabric. And from the moment people began measuring them, they've been hard to stop thinking about. Depending on which source you read, you'll see different numbers for their length and their weight. One will say 750 tons, another 900. Someone else will round up to 1,000 or even 1,200 tons. At first glance, it looks like no one can agree on something as simple as how heavy a rock is. But the stones themselves haven't changed. What's changing are the assumptions behind the calculations. To estimate the weight of a huge block like this, you need 3 things: its dimensions, the density of the stone, and some honesty about uncertainty. The dimension sounds straightforward: length, height, depth. Except you can't walk around the block and measure all sides. Most of each stone is buried in the wall. What you see is the exposed face and the joints at the ends. So early explorers and modern researchers alike have had to infer thickness from partial exposures, from nearby similar stones, from cavities where one block is missing. A difference of even 0.5 meter in estimated depth across a block that's more than 19 meters long and over 3 meters high changes the volume significantly. And volume is what you multiply by density to get weight. Then there's the density of the limestone. Rocks are not uniform. The limestone at Baalbek varies in porosity and water content from bed to bed. Some studies use a generic value for limestone. Others use measurements taken from cores or nearby quarries. Tiny differences, a few hundred kilograms per cubic meter, become big differences when you scale up to a house-sized stone. Put these uncertainties together and you get a range, not a single number. That's why some careful modern estimates sit around 750 to 900 metric tons per block, while more optimistic or less constrained calculations push them higher. The blocks haven't grown. But our rulers and our assumptions have shifted. From an engineering point of view, though, you don't need an exact number to understand the problem. Whether you say 700 tons or 1,000, You're in a realm where every choice, how you shape, move, lift, and set the stone, has to be deliberate. There is no casual trial and error with something that can crush a team of workers in an instant. Look closely at the joints between the 3 Trilithon blocks and between them and the courses above and below, and one thing stands out: precision. The visible faces are dressed flat, the margins neatly drafted. The vertical joints between the 3 great stones are tight, far tighter than you'd expect if they'd been dumped into place and nudged roughly together. The horizontal bedding surface on which they rest appears level along their length. Above them, the next course of large ashlar blocks lines up cleanly, following the same straight plane. This tells us something about how they were set. Whoever placed them didn't just get them vaguely into position and shrug. They needed those bearing surfaces to make good contact. A slight tilt, a gap, a misalignment, and you'd concentrate stress in one corner, risking cracks or long-term instability in the wall. Achieving this level of accuracy with such masses implies careful pre-planning. The bedding course beneath had to be cut and levelled in advance. The blocks themselves had to be dressed with an understanding of how they'd meet. And when they were finally manoeuvred into their slots, the builders had to be able to control their movement at the last stages within tolerances of centimetres, maybe less. We still don't know exactly which combination of ramps, levers, rollers, sledges, and human or animal power they used. That's a question we'll come back to. But we can see the outcome, a fit that is both massive and refined, as if scale was not an excuse to be sloppy. This particular style of megalithic masonry, a few extraordinarily large blocks used within an otherwise more normal monumental structure, sits in an interesting place when you compare it to other traditions. In the ancient Near East, large stone terraces and platforms were not uncommon. At places like Tel Tayanat or some of the older Levantine temples, you get big podiums built of sizable ashlar. But sizable there usually means blocks in the 1 to 20 ton range, not hundreds. In the Western Mediterranean, Punic and Hellenistic builders used large stones in fortification walls. But again, nothing quite on this order. If you look farther afield, to the pre-Inca and Inca walls at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, or to the great polygonal walls in parts of Italy, you find different megalithic styles, irregular, are multi-angled blocks interlocking like a 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. Baalbek's Trilithon is nothing like that. Its blocks are orthogonal, rectangular prisms, not polygons. The joints are straightforward vertical seams, not multi-sided interlocks. Even where the Baalbek masonry looks superficially cyclopean, huge stones, tight joints, it lacks the characteristic pattern of Bronze Age Mycenaean walls, which also favour roughly polygonal blocks and a different dressing style. In some ways, the Trilithon fits more comfortably within the logic of Roman and Hellenistic ashlar construction than within any older, mysterious megalith category. The blocks are big, yes, but they're laid in courses, with a clear sense of horizontality and bonding. They're not freestanding monuments. They're components in a highly organised wall system. And yet the jump in scale is real. Roman builders elsewhere certainly used hefty stones. Consider some foundations at Pergamon, or the huge travertine blocks in parts of Rome's own city walls. But Baalbek's western podium, with its stacked giant courses culminating in the Trilithon, stands out even against that background. It's as if a familiar technique has been turned up beyond its usual maximum, pushed until it feels qualitatively different. Which brings us to the question that hovers over the entire complex. Why? Why use blocks this large at all? From a purely structural perspective, you don't need 800-ton stones to build a stable podium. The rest of the wall proves it. The courses above and below, made of much smaller yet still substantial blocks, do their job perfectly well. Across the Roman world, and even major temples and theatres rest securely on foundations made of relatively modest ashlar and concrete. No engineer sat down with a tablet and concluded, "The only way this will stand is if we insert 3 house-sized stones right here." So other possibilities come into focus. One is symbolic. A choice to include a few utterly overwhelming blocks in a key visible stretch of the podium could have been a message carved into the landscape, a demonstration of mastery over stone, labour, and time. A way of making the terrace look not just big but unchallengeably solid, like a fragment of mountain that had consented to be architecture. Another is practical, but in a different sense. Large blocks reduce the number of joints. Fewer joints mean fewer potential weak points, less chance of differential settlement, and perhaps better resistance to seismic forces in a region known for earthquakes. If you have the technology and organisation to quarry, move, and place such stones, you might decide that fewer, larger elements at a critical level of the wall are worth the extraordinary effort. A third possibility edges us back into the question of phases. If part of this western platform has earlier roots, if there was a pre-Roman monumental terrace here, then the use of unusually large blocks might reflect a local or regional tradition that Roman architects chose to incorporate rather than erase. In that scenario, the Trilithon could be both a structural solution and a dialogue with whatever sacred architecture already occupied the hill. At our current level of evidence, we can't say with certainty which of these motives dominated, or whether all of them played a role. What we can say is that no one accidentally ends up with 3 nearly 1,000-ton stones halfway up a podium wall. This was a decision, somewhere in the chain of command, whether in the mind of a Roman engineer, a local master mason, a patron with grand ambitions, or all of them together. Someone looked at the quarries, at the hill, at the plans and said, "We are going to do this the hard way." The Trilithon is that decision, frozen in limestone. Not just a technical challenge, but a statement. And once you've seen those 3 blocks in the wall, it's almost impossible not to turn around, look toward the quarry on the nearby hillside, and wonder what else they thought they could move. If you stand at the western wall long enough staring at the Trilithon, as your attention eventually starts to drift in a particular direction, not down, not up but out, toward the low hills beyond where the limestone rises in gentle layers. That's where the stones came from, not from some distant mountain, not hauled across hundreds of kilometres, but from a quarry that is, in landscape terms, almost next door. Walk, in your mind, away from the temple platform, leave the podium behind, cross the modern road, the fields, the edge of town. You don't go far, just a few hundred metres by line of sight, and there, cut into the bedrock, you find the place where the hill itself was turned into a supply line. This proximity matters. It means the builders weren't fighting a logistical war across the whole region. They were exploiting a geological gift, thick, relatively uniform beds of workable limestone lying almost at the same elevation as the temple terrace. Instead of dragging blocks up a steep slope, they could plan a route with gentle gradients. Instead of coordinating shipments from distant quarries, they could treat the hillside as an extension of the construction site. But when you step into that quarry, the calm logic of nearby stone source collides with something much stranger. Lying there, half emerged from the rock, is a stone so large that even the Trilithon begins to look modest. Locals call it Hajar el-Hibla, the stone of the pregnant woman, a name wrapped in stories, about a woman cursed, or a stone that will never be born from the earth. In guidebooks and documentaries, it's the celebrity of Baalbek's quarry, a single limestone block. It is still attached along part of its underside to the bedrock, measuring roughly 20 metres long and over 4 metres high, with width estimates around 4 to 5 metres. Using reasonable values for limestone density, modern estimates often place it well over 1,000 metric tons. Some calculations push into the 1,200-ton range. Whatever exact figure you choose, it is heavier than any block actually set in the temple podium. It is one of the largest stones ever quarried by humans anywhere, and it never left the pit, and it isn't alone. Just beyond it, excavations in recent years have revealed another even larger block, lying parallel, also partly freed from the bedrock. This second giant appears longer and perhaps slightly thicker, with some weight estimates creeping toward 1,600 to 1,700 tons. A third massive monolith, known for longer, lies a bit farther away, again cut but not moved. So in this one quarry we have a strange tableau, at least 3 immense stones, each one larger than the Trilithon blocks, carefully outlined, partially undercut, painstakingly shaped, and abandoned. Why? Here, we leave the realm of simple description and step into a landscape of possibilities. One straightforward explanation is technical failure. When you quarry a block of this size, you're making a bet on the internal integrity of the rock. From the surface, the bed might look homogeneous, but limestone beds can hide flaws. Thin clay seams, subtle fractures, variations in cementation. If a significant crack appears during extraction, perhaps as you deepen the undercut, or as the weight begins to shift, you've got a disaster on your hands. For a 5-ton block, you can recut, trim, salvage something. For a 1,200-ton block, a structural flaw that runs through the interior can render the entire piece unusable for its intended position. It's like discovering, halfway through carving a colossal statue, that the stone's heart is shattered. Some researchers have suggested just that for the stone of the pregnant woman. Close inspection shows irregularities and potential hairline cracks that might have convinced the quarry masters it wasn't worth the effort to free and move it, especially if it was intended for a critical high-stress location in the podium. Another possibility is miscalculation. If you're planning to slot a colossal block into a wall at a specific height, the quarrying dimensions have to match the architectural design with some precision. You need to know not only the size you want in the wall, but also the allowances for trimming, dressing, and transport. It's possible that as construction advanced, plans changed, the exact dimensions needed for the next giant course shifted, or the realization dawned that a slightly smaller block would suffice, or be easier to handle. Under that scenario, the huge stones in the quarry may represent an early, extremely ambitious phase of planning, later scaled back. The team might have started by aiming for blocks even larger than the Trilithon stones, then decided partway through the project that there was such a thing as too big for the techniques and time they had. So then there are the less visible forces: politics, funding, catastrophe. Baalbek's Great Terrace was not built in a weekend. Large temple complexes often stretched over decades, even centuries, with shifting emperors, changing priorities, periods of investment and neglect. If a patron died, if an imperial budget tightened, if war or internal unrest pulled resources away, a quarry operation could simply stop. The half-finished stones become frozen project plans, caught mid-sentence when someone closed the book. Earthquakes offer another potential interruption. The Bekaa Valley lies in a seismically active region. A significant quake during the construction phase could have cracked partially freed blocks, damaged lifting infrastructure, or triggered a reassessment of risk. If your largest test pieces suddenly show new fractures after a tremor, you might decide not to stake the stability of your temple on them. These scenarios are not mutually exclusive. A flaw in the stone might have been the immediate reason to abandon one block, while shifting plans or political changes halted work on another. The crucial point is that the quarry preserves evidence of intention and of limits, what the builders aimed for and where reality pushed back. And that evidence isn't just in the size of the stones, it's written in the marks all around them. Walk mentally along the sides of the stone of the pregnant woman. You can follow the extraction trench that outlines its perimeter, a continuous groove cut into the bedrock along the long sides and ends, like the frame around a colossal sculpture waiting to be lifted out. These trenches weren't decorative. They were working spaces. Teams of quarrymen would have deepened them gradually using iron tools, picks, chisels, wedges, to isolate the block from the surrounding bed. At intervals, you can trace shallow recesses or notches where wooden or metal levers may have been inserted to test for movement, to gauge how much of the underside was still holding. In some areas, you see rounded pits or sockets carved into the block's surface. These may have been intended as anchor points for lifting or dragging systems, places where wooden beams, ropes, or metal clamps could bite into the stone. They show that the builders were not simply thinking about carving a shape, they were thinking ahead to transport. The underside, where visible, tells its own story. That quarrymen would have driven wedges into channels cut beneath the block, wetting wooden wedges to make them expand, slowly building up pressure until the stone separated along a plane. It's a method known from many ancient quarries in the Mediterranean and Near East. Nothing about it requires lost technology. What's unusual here is the scale and the willingness to apply familiar extraction logic to unprecedented masses. Taken together, the trenches, the undercut surfaces, the tool marks and anchor points show a continuous chain of reasoning. First, identify a thick, uniform limestone bed. Then, outline a block of the desired dimensions with vertical cuts. Next, deepen those cuts into trenches wide enough for workers and tools. After that, progressively undercut the block, leaving feet or ridges of stone to hold it in place until you're ready for the final separation. Finally, prepare the surfaces where lifting or dragging devices will attach. At Baalbek's quarry, we see this process halted at different stages. One block is almost ready to be freed, with most of its underside cut. Another is at an earlier phase, more of its base still married to the hill. They are like snapshots in a technical manual whose last pages are missing. What those snapshots tell us is that the builder's ambition was not limited to the Trilithon. They were planning, or at least experimenting with, stones significantly larger than any they ultimately installed. The quarry is where their aspirations appear raw, before being filtered by what actually made it into the wall. If you think of the temple podium as the finished performance, the quarry is the rehearsal space. Here the engineers and masons pushed the boundaries of what they thought they could do. Sometimes they succeeded spectacularly. The Trilithon set in place proves that. Sometimes, as the abandoned giants show, the project ran into practical limits, of material, of technique, of circumstance. This doesn't make the site less impressive. It makes it more human. Instead of imagining anonymous super beings casually tossing 1,000-ton blocks around, we can picture teams of very real workers and planners standing in this quarry, running numbers in their heads, testing the stone, listening to the creak of wedges, watching for hairline fractures. We can imagine debates about whether to risk one more cut, one more attempt at an even larger block, knowing that a single misjudgment could waste months of labour. The stone of the pregnant woman and its companions are not evidence of magic. They are evidence of a construction program that operated right at the edge of what was feasible in its time, sometimes stepping over that edge and being forced to retreat. And that brings us to the next question. If they could carve such stones and sometimes chose not to move them, how did they handle the ones they did? What did it actually look like to take a mass of 700, 800, 900 tons from this quarry to that wall, and to do it without steel cranes, diesel engines, or modern concrete? To answer that, we have to leave the quarry, follow the imagined path of the blocks across the slope, and think carefully about ramps, sledges, friction, and the organised strength of thousands of hands. So, no magic, no anti-gravity, no secret laser cranes buried under the Lebanese hills. If you take those off the table, and we should, the question isn't, how could they possibly move it? But what did clever, tool-using people, with a lot of time and a lot of labour, already know how to do? Because by the time Baalbek's Great Terrace was being planned, humans had a very old, very practical toolbox for moving heavy things. Start with the simplest piece, the sledge. Not a wheeled cart, not a chariot, just a heavy wooden platform, beams lashed together, with the front end curved upward so it doesn't dig into the ground. You put the stone on top or under it, with cribbing and packing stones to align it. Then you pull the sledge, and the sledge drags the stone. We know this wasn't just a theoretical idea. Egyptian tomb paintings, Mesopotamian reliefs, Greek and Roman texts all show or describe sledges dragging statues, obelisks and building blocks. On a small scale, sledges are still used in parts of the world today to haul logs and stones where wheels don't make sense. At first glance, that sounds primitive, even inefficient. But the physics is on the sledge's side. The main enemy in moving a 1,000-ton block is not the weight itself. Weight gives you resistance, yes, but what really decides whether you can shift it is friction. How much the surfaces resist sliding past each other. Reduce that friction, and the same group of people can move far more than you'd expect. The builders at Baalbek didn't have physics textbooks, but they had experience. Across the ancient Mediterranean, you see the same tricks again and again. You smoother the path, you compact the ground, you lay down wooden planks, you wet the surface, you grease it with oil, animal fat, clay slip, or a slurry of water and fine sediment. Some experiments suggest that adding the right amount of water to a sandy surface can cut friction roughly in half. There's even an Egyptian tomb painting showing workers pouring liquid in front of a sledge carrying a colossal statue. Now return to the short distance between quarry and podium. It's a gift. You don't need wheels for a long road journey. You need a few hundred meters of carefully prepared ground, designed for one purpose. Let this massive object slide. Imagine the route as a kind of engineered corridor. On the quarry side, you cut a trench and a shallow ramp so the stone, nacelle, now freed and placed on a timber sledge or wooden cribbing, can be brought up to roughly the same level as the temple terrace. Along the route, you level and pack the earth. Where the natural slope dips, you build it up. Where it rises too steeply, you cut it back. In some reconstructions, people picture logs under the stone, like cartoon rollers. That method is well attested for smaller loads, but for something in the hundreds of tons, repeated crushing of the logs becomes a serious problem. Rollers might have been used in particular sections or under the sledge runners, but the core strategy that scales is slide the load over a deliberately low-friction surface, not over a loose forest of sacrificial timbers. And to make that sliding possible, you don't just rely on muscle. You systematize the pull. Here, or another group of old technologies enters the scene. Levers, capstans and winches. The lever is as ancient as curiosity. A long wooden beam, a support point, and someone who realizes that you can lift a little to move a lot. In the quarry, levers help you test whether a block is free, raise one side a few centimeters, slide timbers underneath. On the transport route, they let you nudge the sledge sideways, adjust alignment, correct drifting. The capstan and winch turn that same principle of mechanical advantage into organized pull. Picture a vertical wooden post set in a socket in the ground, with horizontal bars coming off it like spokes. Wrap a thick rope around the post several times, fix the other end to the stone or the sledge. When workers push the spokes in a circle, the rope winds in, turning rotational motion into a steady, controlled pulling force. Romans used capstans and similar devices on ships and at construction sites. Vitruvius, the Roman writer on architecture, describes them casually as standard equipment. Combine several capstans in line or in parallel, and you can apply immense sustained force, far more than a simple rope and pull can deliver. Winches, horizontal spindles with cranks, work on the same idea. You trade distance for power. The stone inches forward, but it does move, and you can pause, reblock, adjust. All of this only functions if the path is prepared and if the workforce is coordinated. Here, season mattered. In a Mediterranean mountain valley, you don't treat the year as a uniform stretch of time. You look for windows, months when the ground has enough moisture to compact well, but not so much that it turns into a swamp. Cold periods when frozen or semi-frozen earth bears weight better and reduces friction. Times when agricultural demands are lower and more hands can be allocated to state projects. We don't have a Roman construction calendar pinned to a notice board at Baalbek, but we do know that large imperial works typically pulsed with the rhythms of the year. Earthworks, hauling, and mass labour during seasons when fields didn't demand everyone's presence. More skilled, precise activities, dressing stones, setting columns, decorative carving, in other periods. Think of it as a breathing project. One phase uses huge numbers of workers to reshape the landscape, cutting ramps, widening paths, shoring up embankments, laying wooden trackways. Another phase uses those same routes to drag loads, with foremen managing teams, rotating shifts, making sure no section of the route is overloaded or allowed to erode. The manpower numbers for a single giant block can sound unreal. Hundreds, even over 1,000 people pulling, others guiding, others managing lubrication, replacing planks, shouting cadence. But in an imperial context, drawing on local populations, military detachments, and specialized guilds, assembling such a force for a limited period was not out of reach. The Roman state moved armies of tens of thousands across continents. Mobilizing 1,000 for a prestige temple was an exercise in logistics, not science fiction. Getting the block from quarry to platform is only part one. The part that really stretches the imagination is placement. How do you get a stone weighing hundreds of tons up to a wall face already several meters high, and then slide it precisely into position, without cranes big enough to lift it freely? The most likely answer is, you don't lift it vertically at all. You bring the wall down to the stone by raising the ground. Earthen ramps are the quiet heroes of ancient megalithic construction. They don't leave glamorous remains. Later generations often quarry them away, rework them into terraces, or let them erode back into the hillside. But where we do have traces, in Egypt, at Assyrian sites, at some Greek and Roman constructions, the logic is clear. If you don't want to hoist something, you make the world into a gentle slope. Visualize a massive packed earth ramp running up to, and sometimes over, the future height of the podium course. The block on its sledge is hauled not to the base of a wall, but along this rising artificial ground, until it reaches a level slightly above its eventual resting place. Then, using levers, smaller jacks, wedges, and controlled removal of fill, you let it down onto prepared stone beds. The act of lowering may be only tens of centimeters at a time, but done systematically along the entire length of the block, it allows placement with surprising precision. As each giant block is set, parts of the ramp can be trimmed back, reused, or extended for the next course. The final terrace we see today is the result of building up stone while gradually removing the temporary earth that made such placement possible. Can we point to a perfect intact Baalbek ramp and say, here it is? No, that's where we bump into the limits of evidence. Earth is malleable. 2,000 years of weather, agriculture, later construction. An excavation can erase or heavily modify the scars of ancient ramps and roads. Some researchers see hints of old embankments and cuttings around the podium that might be remnants of such structures, but they're not as clear-cut as the stones themselves. So we're left with a combination of things we know people could do, things we see them doing elsewhere, and what basic mechanics allows. We know ancient builders used sledges, lubrication, prepared roads, levers, capstans and ramps to move and place blocks in the tens and low hundreds of tons. We know the Romans, specifically, had a rich repertoire of lifting and hauling gear. We know the distance between Baalbek's quarry and podium is short, and the terrain manageable with engineering. On top of that, calculations by modern engineers show that, with reasonable friction, coefficients and large but plausible workforces, dragging a 700 or 800-ton stone up a shallow slope is hard, but not impossible. It doesn't require alien metallurgy or knowledge of quantum fields. It requires organisation, patience, and a willingness to throw human labour at a problem over months or years. What we don't know, because no ancient manual has surfaced, and no clear ramp lies untouched, is the exact sequence. Did they use one enormous ramp or a series of smaller ones? Did they rely mainly on sledges over packed soil, or did they incorporate timber tracks and limited rolling elements? Exactly how many capstans, how many teams, how often did they pause and reblock? Those details are where the story fades from solid ground into interpretive mist. But that mist is a different kind of mystery than the ones in sensational headlines. It's not, no one can explain this. It's we can sketch the outlines, but the choreography of movements, the shouted orders, the daily routines of the workers, that part is gone. What remains are the stones in the wall, the giants left behind in the quarry, and the knowledge that somewhere between them lay a network of ramps, sledges and human hands, turning friction and force into a terrace that still towers over the Beaker Valley. To get closer to the builders themselves and not just their tools, we have to look beyond the mechanics and ask, who are these people, whose days were spent hauling and heaving at the edge of what was possible? The terrace itself is the quiet giant in this story. The mind jumps to the big blocks, the famous Trilithon, the myths about impossible weights. But if you strip all of that away, the first thing any builder has to solve at Baalbek is more basic, more invisible. Where do you put the temple so it doesn't move? Across the ancient world, the answer shows up again and again. You don't just plop a sacred building on raw ground. You make a platform, a podium, an artificial hill of stone, Egyptian pylons standing on raised courts, Mesopotamian ziggurats rising as stepped terraces, Greek temples on stylobates, Roman temples lifted high on podiums you have to climb with a flight of stairs. From the Andes to India, the instinct is the same. Put the god up higher. Part of that is symbolism. Height separates the sacred from the ordinary. The act of ascending prepares the mind. A temple on a flat field feels like a house. A temple on a podium feels like a destination. But there's another colder reason. When you step back and look at Baalbek's setting, it isn't just a picturesque valley. It's a problem. The Bekaa is a broad, fertile trough between mountain ranges. Valleys like this are usually built from layers of alluvial deposits, silts, clays, gravels washed down from the hills for thousands of years. Good for crops, not always great for load-bearing. Add water to that. The site receives winter rains, snow in the surrounding mountains, seasonal runoff. If you dig below the modern surface, you don't find a clean sheet of solid, dry rock. You find horizons, softer soils over harder layers, zones that swell when wet and shrink when dry, pockets that take on water and release it slowly. For a farmer, that's life. For an engineer trying to support thousands of tons of masonry, that's risk. Temple podiums are, among other things, elaborate solutions to that risk. Imagine standing on the bare ground at Baalbek before any stone is laid. If you put your weight here, the earth might be firm. 3 steps away, it might be slightly more compressible. Over decades, centuries, a heavy wall on those uneven supports will settle at different rates. One side sinks, the other doesn't. Cracks form, joints open. In a place that shakes with earthquakes, slight weaknesses can become catastrophic failures. The answer is to even out the relationship between building and earth. You do that by spreading the load, by creating an artificial stratum, your podium, that behaves more predictably than the patchwork below. So, under the shining temple that visitors see, there is usually a world of stone they never think about. Retaining walls, fill layers, drainage channels, foundation courses keyed into any available bedrock. Platforms that widen as they go down like a stepped pyramid hidden inside the hill. At Baalbek, the podium of the Temple of Jupiter is exactly this kind of man-made cliff. On its outer faces you see those huge blocks in orderly courses. Behind them, the mass thickens into internal walls and vaulted substructures. Below them, archaeologists find older terraces, earlier walls, earlier phases of construction. The whole thing is not a single monolithic slab, but a stack of interventions, each one trying to tame the ground a bit more. Drainage is the quiet companion to all of this. Stone hates water in the wrong place. Trapped moisture can leach salts, rot mortar, erode joints. Flowing water can undermine foundations. When you hear platform, you might picture a solid plug of stone, but ancient builders knew better. They left cavities, channels, sometimes even great underground culverts to steer water away from where it could do harm. A huge flat terrace is like a roof. If you don't give the water somewhere to go, it will make its own way. So somewhere within or immediately below that podium there would have been a logic of gradients and outlets, slight slopes to direct flow, rubble and smaller stones used as permeable fill, drains to carry winter rain off the sacred platform and down into safer paths. The Romans were famously obsessed with water management, aqueducts, sewers, street drains. That mindset doesn't stop at the podium's edge. It's built into the way they shaped the land. Now bring the giant stones back into the picture. Why put blocks weighing hundreds of tons in the upper courses of a retaining wall? Why not build it all from smaller, more manageable pieces? One answer is impact. Enormous stones speak. They say, this place matters. This empire has resources. This god commands effort. There's a reason later visitors stared at the Trilithon in disbelief long before anyone started talking about aliens. But beyond spectacle, those blocks also behave differently than a swarm of small ones. Every joint between stones is a potential line of weakness. Mortar helps, careful dressing helps, but in an earthquake or over centuries of slight movements, tiny separations can open up. Water can get in. Individual pieces can shift relative to each other. A single very long block, seated properly, acts more like a continuous beam. Fewer vertical joints, fewer planes where things can slip, fewer pathways for water. Put a row of such stones near the top of a high retaining wall, and you create a strong horizontal tie, like a belt cinched tight around the structure. Imagine that long block trying to move. For its then to shift outward, the whole mass of masonry beneath and beside it has to deform. That distributes forces. Instead of one small block popping out like a loose tooth, the system resists as a whole. This is where lateral forces come in. A terrace wall is not just holding up the temple above, it's holding back the earth behind it. Soil wants to spread, especially when it's wet. When an earthquake passes through, the shaking doesn't only push up and down, it shoves sideways. That backfilled earth can behave almost like a heavy sluggish liquid pressing outward. If your wall is just a stack of stones, each independent, those pressures look for any line of least resistance. If your wall is stitched together by giant blocks running deep into the structure, their weight and continuity can help keep everything in place. It's not that a massive stone is magically earthquake-proof. Nothing is, especially not in the Levant. This region sits in a complex tectonic zone. The Dead Sea transform, the intersection of African, Arabian and Eurasian plates all close by. Historical records and geological evidence show major quakes affecting Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, northern Israel. Cities have cracked, collapsed, been rebuilt more than once. Ancient builders didn't have plate tectonics diagrams, but they had experience. They saw walls lean after a tremor. They knew which kinds of structures survived better: wider bases, thicker, lower levels, careful bonding between inner and outer faces, occasional giant staples tying everything together. At Baalbek, you can read some of those instincts in stone. The outer podium walls don't stand straight up like a sheer modern retaining wall. In places they have a slight batter, a subtle inward lean that helps them counteract outward pressure. The largest blocks are not just stuck onto the front like a decorative veneer. They are part of courses that key back into the mass, interlocking with inner stones. Some scholars think the Trilithon and the even larger stones prepared in the quarry were intended as deep binding elements, not merely facade. Others argue that the most gigantic blocks might be overkill from a structural point of view, edging into symbolic excess. That question, pragmatism versus theatre, runs through almost every discussion of Baalbek's engineering. On one side, there's a compelling practical case. Huge stones, fewer joints, you're a better resistance to creep and lateral thrust. Heavy units, you don't have to clamp together with metal because their sheer mass stabilizes them. A podium deeply keyed into the hillside, redistributing loads over a broad footprint, softening the effects of uneven subsurface soils and long-term settlement. On the other side, there's the Roman habit of turning practicality into spectacle. They knew how to vault a roof efficiently, but also how to make it soar. They knew how thick a column needed to be, but also how to thicken it a little more to impress. At Baalbek, the decision to use blocks far larger than typical Roman standards may have started as an engineering advantage, and then taken on a life of its own as a statement. Look what we can do, carved into the landscape. It's possible both readings are true at once. A giant terrace, raised above the valley floor, solves drainage, settlement and stability problems in a seismic water-cut valley. At the same time, its height and the gigantic modules that form its crown proclaim power, of empire, of God, of human will over stone, and that duality runs all through Baalbek. Everywhere you look, practical decisions about soil, slopes, water and shaking ground are wrapped in layers of meaning. A retaining wall is also a stage for tectonic theatre. A podium is both footing and throne. To understand who made those decisions and why they were willing to spend so much time wrestling with earth and gravity, we have to step away from the stones themselves and turn toward the people behind them. The architects sketching lines, the engineers checking slopes, the labourers whose hands turn design into reality. When you stand in front of the podium at Baalbek, it's tempting to imagine a single kind of builder, a mysterious ancient people, a lost civilization, or, in the more sober version, just the Romans, as if an entire empire showed up one morning with chisels in hand and went to work. Reality is slower, messier, more human. Think of Baalbek not as one project with one team, but as a long-layered collaboration between different kinds of people, some whose names we have, emperors, governors, most whose names we don't, stonecutters, haulers, mortar mixers, whose fingerprints are still caught in dried plaster deep inside the ruins. At the very top of the pyramid you have Rome itself, not Rome the city, but Rome the system, imperial budgets, provincial taxes, decisions made in distant rooms about which cities deserved grand monuments and which didn't. Baalbek, Roman Heliopolis, was picked to be a showpiece, a great cult centre in a fertile valley, on a route that knitted together Syria, the coast and the interior. Turning it into a colossal sanctuary wasn't an act of local whim, it was an imperial statement. Money flowed from above, marble sometimes, architects sometimes, political will almost always. But Rome didn't build with money alone. It built by tapping into local worlds of skill. under those high-level patrons you get a different sort of figure, the architectus and the engineer. In Latin inscriptions across the empire, these people occasionally surface: a name, a title, curator of works, builder of the temple. They're the ones who turned imperial, we want something big here, into actual plans. At Baalbek, the master planners would have been trained in Roman methods: how to align a sanctuary, how to dimension a column drum, how to calculate ramp gradients and crane loads. They brought with them a mental toolkit shaped by aqueducts, amphitheatres, roads, but they didn't arrive in a blank landscape. Long before the eagles of Rome flew over the beaker, there were already masons here. Farmers who knew this soil. Quarrymen who knew where the limestone seams ran, which layers fractured cleanly, and which turned to chalky sludge under the chisel. So the Roman project was less like an invasion of skills and more like a braid. The imperial expertise and expectations twisted together with local traditions and know-how. Syrian and Phoenician stonemasons who had been repairing older shrines were suddenly working under Roman standards. Roman surveyors were suddenly learning how this particular hillside behaved in winter. On the ground, the workforce was not one thing. Imagine the sight on a busy day. Up on the terrace, you have specialized craftsmen, men shaping column drums with long iron tools, others laying out the fine mouldings that would frame doorways and cornices. They work in small teams, each group responsible for a specific element: capitals, bases, carved friezes. Nearby, surveyors check alignments with simple but effective tools: the groma for right angles, water levels and plumb bobs for verticals and horizontals. They're the quiet ones, moving stakes, adjusting strings, making sure the lines sketched by the architect on a wax tablet actually land in the right place in stone. Down at the quarry, another world. Stonecutters work the bedrock face, talking to each other over the ring of iron on stone. They're not just hacking randomly. They follow bedding planes and natural fractures, reading the rock like a book. Grooves are cut, wedges inserted, water poured, expansion harnessed to free a block that has sat in the hillside for millions of years. Around them, haulers gather, teams of men whose main tool is muscle and rhythm. Some are local villagers hired seasonally, others may be more permanent labourers attached to the project, paid in coin, food, or both. In big undertakings, Roman military units could be pulled in as well, soldiers who, when not drilling or patrolling, were ordered to build roads, dig foundations, drag stones. Some of the workforce would have been there by obligation rather than choice. Roman cities relied heavily on what we might call civic duties, corvée labour, days when citizens or residents were expected to contribute physical work to public projects. For provincial subjects, this obligation could be heavy. Whole communities might be required to send a certain number of workers for a certain number of days each year. Alongside them, there were almost certainly enslaved people. The Roman world ran on slavery in ways that are hard to overstate. Enslaved labourers cut stone, carried loads, moved earth. At Baalbek, some of the most back-breaking repetitive tasks, the endless carrying of rubble, mixing of mortar, or hauling of smaller blocks, may have fallen mostly on people who had no freedom to walk away. But not everyone on site was interchangeable. Within this broad mass of labourers you had narrower streams of expertise. Stonecutters formed something like guilds before guilds were formalised. A boy might start by carrying tools and fetching water, then be allowed to rough out blocks, then eventually learn how to dress a face smooth enough to take a tight joint. Tricks of the trade, how to angle a chisel to avoid a hidden flaw, how to hear when a block was nearly ready to split, were passed down within families or tight work crews. Craft knowledge didn't live in books, it lived in hands and habits. Move from Syria to Egypt, and you see different favoured profiles, different ways of drafting joints. Move from Baalbek to another Levantine city, and the basic techniques stay the same: But the details, the way an edge is chamfered, the standard sizes of blocks, reveal a local accent. These regional traditions meant that a Roman building in Lebanon doesn't look quite like a Roman building in Spain, even if both were funded by the same emperor. At Baalbek, the podium's huge blocks and the particular way they're set into the hillside suggest a continuity with Near Eastern terrace building that predates Rome. At the same time, the overall plan, the column orders, the ornamental vocabulary, echo what Roman architects were doing across the eastern Mediterranean. Two lineages intersecting. Above the master masons and below the architects there was probably another layer. Foremen and work gang leaders. They're invisible in the stones, but someone had to coordinate all this. Who worked which shift at the quarry? When the next course could be laid? How to time the arrival of a giant block so the ramp was ready and the pulling team assembled? On really large jobs, Romans sometimes brought in itinerant specialists, engineers who knew how to assemble and operate large lifting machines, carpentry experts who could build the wooden frames and scaffolds needed to maneuver multi-ton stones, rope makers who could twist cables strong enough for the task, drawing on traditions from harbours and ships. These people would move from project to project across the empire, leaving behind not monuments with their names, but slight changes in how things were done. A new joint type here, a more efficient hoisting technique there. Skill moved the way genes do in a scattered animal population, not in a straight line, but in pulses when a crafty individual migrated, taught a few tricks, then either stayed or moved on. If you zoom back even further, the question who built Baalbek stops pointing at a single people and starts to look like a web. At one node, you have emperors signing off on expenses. At another, provincial governors eager to impress, to leave their mark in stone. At others, city councils negotiating how much labour and money they could spare, local elites donating funds for altars or columns in exchange for having their names carved into them. Below that are the architects, some from Italy, some born in the East, fluent in both Roman building codes and local styles. Below them, master masons anchored in regional traditions. Below them, teams of semi-skilled labourers. And threaded through it all, the hands of enslaved men, women, and perhaps children, whose work was essential but whose identities have vanished into anonymity. No single group can honestly claim the podium at Baalbek as theirs alone. It is Roman and local, imperial and provincial, elite planned and labour built. When later visitors ask, who could have built such a thing? The mind jumps to the exotic answer. Giants, aliens, some vanished super-civilization. But the podium answers in a quieter voice. We were built by networks, by many kinds of people doing different kinds of work over decades, by skills carried in memory, not in blueprints, by an empire that knew how to turn taxes into stone, and by villages that sent their sons up the hill when the summons came. If there is a mystery, it is not about whether humans could do this. It is about how many layers of human stories can be compressed into a single block of limestone, and how, when you look at a wall, almost all of those stories have already slipped out of view. The great terrace of Jupiter stands not just on foundations of stone, but on foundations of organization, on the ability of ancient societies to coordinate thousands of actions day after day, year after year. And that ability, more than any one machine or method, is what makes Baalbek feel uncanny. Because once you accept that ordinary human beings created this cliff of masonry, another question starts to form in the back of your mind. If they could marshal people and knowledge like that, what else were they capable of? And how much of it have we already lost to time? Centuries pass, the tools fall silent, the last scaffolds rot away. Roofs collapse, statues lose their faces to rain and frost, but the platform remains. When Rome's power thins and frays, the great sanctuary at Heliopolis does not simply vanish. It sheds one skin and grows another. In late antiquity, the cult statues are removed or smashed. Some temples are repurposed for new religions, some simply left to weather. Local communities move closer or farther away, depending on how safe the valley feels in a given century. Then new armies begin to move across the Levant. By the early Middle Ages, the giant terrace that once carried Jupiter's temple has become something slightly different in people's minds, a fortress. If you have walls already 15-20 meters high, made of interlocking stones that no ordinary siege engine can rattle, you don't start from scratch, you patch, you adapt. You crown the old work with new. Under Byzantine, then early Islamic rule, the sanctuary turns into a fortified citadel. Arches are walled up, passageways are turned into barracks and storerooms. The elegant Roman staircases that once led pilgrims upward now bring soldiers to lookout posts. Later, under the Ayyubids and Mamluks, and in the shadow of the Crusades, this process intensifies. The site that the Romans had armoured with sheer mass becomes part of a medieval defensive network. Watchtowers sprout from classical corners. Arrow slits cut through once ornamental masonry. Masonry that had been carved for gods is reused for parapets and battlements. You can almost picture the conversations. A medieval commander walking the ramparts with a local mason, looking up at the Trilithon blocks half buried in the massive podium. "Who put those there?" he asks, a shrug. A gesture back vaguely toward the age of the ancients. Rum, in Arabic sources, the Romans, or, more hazily, a time when giants might have walked the earth. Because by now, the chain of practical knowledge that built the terrace has snapped. No one alive knows how to quarry and move 800-ton blocks because no one needs to. The empire that required such gestures is gone. The social machinery that fed thousands of workers on a hill for decades at a time has dissolved into smaller, more precarious polities. What's left are the stones, stripped of their construction story but still undeniably there. So the meaning begins to drift. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Crusader forces push into the region. They see Baalbek not as a sanctuary, but as a strategic node, and Frankish chroniclers mention it as a stronghold contested, besieged, traded in treaties. They call it Baalbek or Baalbek, an echo of older names already coated in layers of story. To them, the colossal masonry is not particularly miraculous. Medieval Europe is full of misattributed ruins, cyclopean walls, dolmens, megaliths. Most are simply slotted into a familiar framework, made by the ancients, a civilization imagined as unified and remote. But over time, as warfare ebbs and travellers replace armies, something subtler happens. The fortress function fades, the wonder function grows. By the early modern period, as Ottoman authority settles over the region, Baalbek becomes less a contested bastion and more an out-of-the-way curiosity. Local inhabitants farm among the fallen columns, stable animals in the shadow of half-collapsed halls, mine the ruins for convenient stone. Meanwhile, word of a strange place in the Bekaa filters along trade routes and pilgrimage paths. A place where walls are made of stones so big that even seasoned masons shake their heads. For people whose daily building material is mud brick or small field stones, the contrast is dizzying. The ruins become a backdrop to stories. There's a human tendency. When skill drops below visibility, imagination fills the gap. So in local folklore, explanations bloom. Some say the blocks were placed by jinn, powerful spirits forced into labour by a great king. Others whisper that the platform predates even Solomon, that it was the work of primordial peoples, giants who strode over mountains. These stories are less about geology and engineering than about scale. They are an attempt to align human experience with something that, at first glance, doesn't fit. Then another kind of visitor arrives. The early European travellers. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as curiosity about the Orient grows in Europe, learned men begin to move along the old caravan routes with notebooks and measuring sticks. They come to Baalbek with a different toolkit, not ropes and levers, but sketches and numbers. Yet their first reaction isn't scientific, it's emotional. They stand under the remaining columns, dwarfed by their height. They walk along the base of the podium and lay hands on the Trilithon, counting off their own arm spans and finding that they barely make a dent in the length. They do what humans have always done in front of overwhelming architecture. They try to compare it to something they know. Only now, instead of giants and gin, the comparison is with Greece and Rome. Some early travellers wonder aloud if Baalbek might be older than anything in classical Europe. Others argue that it must be one of the greatest Roman works, perhaps of the time of Augustus or Hadrian. They write journals and letters home. They include little line drawings, columns marching against a mountainous backdrop, shattered entablatures, the great retaining wall with its absurdly large blocks marked out in ink. These texts circulate. They're read by people who will never see Lebanon. In the minds of those readers, Baalbek becomes an almost mythical place, half known, half imagined. And in that gap, the idea of mystery begins to harden. Because the more the early visitors measure, the stranger the numbers look on the page. A single stone, they report, is more than 20 metres long, nearly 5 metres high and deep. Another lies in the quarry, still larger, almost impossible to describe without resorting to comparisons with ships or houses. On the one hand, the travellers do what careful observers do. They note quarry marks. They trace the alignment between the cut faces in the hillside and the blocks in the podium. Some even speculate about ramps and rollers, about earth built up to create high working surfaces. On the other hand, their tone is often tinged with awe that borders on disbelief. They are not engineers. They do not live in a world where moving 500-ton industrial components is a routine calculation. For them, how did they do this is not merely a technical question. It's an invitation to wonder. Their published accounts seed that wonder far beyond the valley. In the 19th century, the tools change again. Photography arrives. Where earlier illustrations could be accused of exaggeration, too many columns, too grand a sky, glass plate negatives seem, to contemporaries, objective. A camera cannot lie, people say. Photographers trek to Baalbek with bulky equipment, hauling tripods and chemicals up the same slopes where Roman haulers once dragged stone. They frame the Trilithon wall so that a human figure stands at its base, tiny as a toy soldier against the mass of limestone. They capture the fallen columns in the Temple of Jupiter, the intact colonnade of the so-called Temple of Bacchus standing against the sky like the ribs of a petrified beast. These images are printed in albums, sold in European capitals, pinned to the walls of parlours. For the first time, a broad public can see, not just hear about, the size of the stones, and seeing changes things. What had been a scholar's curiosity becomes a popular fascination. Guidebooks begin to include Baalbek in their itineraries. Travel writers describe the journey, the valley, the moment of first sight, when the ruins emerge from the landscape like a shipwreck from the mist. Alongside this, early archaeology starts to professionalize the study of the site. Teams come not just to marvel, but to clear rubble, map foundations, catalogue inscriptions. They draw precise plans, elevations, sections. They note phases, Roman cores, medieval fortifications, later repairs. They measure the Trilithon blocks with tape and theodolite, record their dimensions, estimate their weights. They connect them firmly to the Roman phase of construction, not to some lost antediluvian race. In academic publications, Baalbek becomes less a blank enigma and more a data point in a broader story. Roman imperial architecture in the East, the adaptation of classical forms to local topography and traditions. But outside those circles, the legend persists and grows, because the same numbers that to an archaeologist confirm human capability, to a casual reader look almost superhuman. One text says 800 tons, another 1,000. Someone rounds up. Someone copies the larger figure without context. A magazine article drops the caveats and just calls them the largest stones ever moved by man. Each retelling amplifies the sense of puzzle. Sketches, then photographs, then popular histories, all repeat the same refrain. Enormous, inexplicable, beyond our current engineering. The irony is that, in the same period, industrial engineers are routinely lifting locomotives, bridge spans, and iron ship parts of comparable mass with steam power and steel cables. But at Baalbek, the combination of ancient context, fractured records, and visual drama tilts the balance. The scholarly voice, careful and hedged, likely Roman quarrying, probably earth ramps, consistent with other monumental works, is quiet, locked in journals and reports. The public voice is louder. It thrives on phrases like unsolved mystery, puzzles experts, no one knows how. And so a kind of tension crystallizes. On one side, archaeologists, architects and historians building cautious reconstructions, step-by-step sequences of quarrying, moving, setting. None perfect, all open to revision, but grounded in comparative evidence from across the Mediterranean. On the other side, a growing audience for spectacle, primed by illustrated magazines, then documentaries, then the internet, to expect revelations and secrets. Baalbek sits right between those two impulses, a site that is, in many ways, thoroughly explained in its broad strokes. Roman sanctuary, layered with medieval fortifications, framed by local tradition, yet still ringed with edges where our knowledge thins. And it's in those edges that modern myths begin to take root. Because once you tell people, we don't know every detail, many will hear, we know nothing at all. From fortified citadel to tourist postcard, from field sketch to viral photograph, Baalbek's image has been magnified, stretched, and sometimes distorted. The stones themselves have not changed, but the stories wrapped around them have multiplied. And as we move into the age of television specials and online theories, the tension between careful study and wild speculation will only sharpen. The next layer of the Baalbek mystery isn't laid in limestone. It's laid in ideas about giants, lost civilizations, visitors from the stars, and why, even in a world of cranes and quarries, those ideas can feel so strangely compelling. By the late 20th century, Baalbek is carrying more than just the weight of its stones. It's carrying the weight of expectations, because by now the phrase "no one knows how they did it" has had a long time to soak into the popular imagination. It's been repeated in guidebooks, dramatized in travelogues, amplified in documentaries looking for a hook. So when newer media arrive, television, paperbacks with lurid covers, then websites and streaming shows, they inherit a ready-made script, ancient site, giant stones, gaps in the record, insert mystery here, and the theories begin to multiply. In one version, the builders are giants, not metaphorical giants of industry or empire, but literal beings of abnormal size and strength. Sometimes they're the people of Ad, or other half-remembered biblical and Quranic communities. Sometimes they're just the old ones, imagined as towering over ordinary humans, lifting blocks that we struggle to even measure. In another version, the platform is not just big, it's primordial. Atlantean. A remnant, the story goes, of a lost global civilization that mastered stone and geometry before recorded history, only to be wiped out by flood or cataclysm. Rome, in this telling, is a mere tenant. The real architects built the deepest courses, vanished, and left only whispers behind. And then there's the most modern variation. visitors from elsewhere. Here, Baalbek becomes a landing pad, a power station, a beacon. The flatness of the terrace is recast as a runway. The precision of the stonework is treated as a clue that the technology involved could not have been human at all. If you've seen those claims, you've probably noticed how similar they sound even when the supposed builders change. Giants, Atlanteans, aliens, the names shift, but the structure of the story doesn't. Something like this. Ordinary people couldn't possibly have done this. Therefore, someone extraordinary must have. It's important to pause here, not to mock the impulse, but to understand it. Because these fringe theories are not just random oddities, they're cultural phenomena. They tell us as much about the people telling the stories as they do about the stones those stories are wrapped around. Why does Baalbek, specifically, attract these kinds of explanations? Part of it is raw scale. When you stand in front of a block that weighs more than a fully loaded modern airliner, your body has no built-in comparison. Your muscles know what it feels like to lift a bag of grain, to roll a barrel, maybe to move a heavy piece of furniture. 800 tons is beyond intuition. The mind reaches for metaphor. This is where giants slip in, or machines more powerful than anything the ancients were supposed to have, or visitors with gravity-defying craft. Another part is the patchwork nature of the evidence. Baalbek's construction history is not written in a single, continuous inscription carved on a wall. It's reconstructed from scattered clues, tool marks, quarry faces, reused blocks, stylistic parallels with other sites, a handful of texts that mention the sanctuary in passing. For specialists, those bits and pieces add up to a coherent, if incomplete, picture. For a wider audience, the gaps loom larger than the connections. We don't know exactly how they moved each stone quietly morphs, in retellings, into, we have no idea how this was done. Into that perceived void, anything can be inserted. And then there is something deeper and more personal, a human love of mystery. The world you and I inhabit is, in many ways, demystified. We can look up how suspension bridges are built, how rockets work, how heavy lift cranes operate. We can see footage of 1,000-ton components being inched into place by hydraulic jacks and crawler platforms. Baalbek sits at an intersection between that world and another one, an older, rougher world where much of what people did was not written down, and where erosion, earthquakes and looting have erased many of the intermediate steps. That mixture, massive object, partial record, pre-industrial date, creates a kind of cultural pressure. Some people lean into the slow, careful work of reconstruction. Others lean into the thrill of imagining. Neither impulse is wrong, but they are different games. One way to navigate between them is to quietly bring in a few tools of critical thinking, not as weapons, but as instruments, ways to ask better questions while keeping the sense of wonder intact. One such tool is the idea of burden of proof. If someone proposes an extraordinary explanation, say, that Baalbek's platform is a piece of alien infrastructure, they are making a claim that reaches far beyond what we already know about human history. The burden is on that claim to provide equally extraordinary evidence, not just this is big and we don't fully understand it, but concrete testable traces, artifacts that clearly aren't human workmanship, anomalous materials, inscriptions in unknown languages, physical evidence that doesn't fit any known cultural or geological context. So far, nothing like that has turned up at Baalbek. What we do have are familiar things: Roman inscriptions, Roman decorative styles, Roman coins, Roman construction techniques layered over older local traditions, quarries with half-cut stones, chisel marks that match tools known from elsewhere, architectural features that echo sanctuaries in Syria, in Turkey, in Italy. Another tool is to look for alternative explanations that fit the same facts. Is an 800-ton block hard to move? Yes. Is it impossible, given enough people, time, wood, rope, and earth? We have no reason to think so. At other sites around the ancient Mediterranean and beyond, we see heavy blocks moved and set using techniques that leave clearer traces: ramps, sledges, log rollers, sand pits, cribbing. We have written descriptions from Egypt and Mesopotamia of large hauling teams, of engineers calculating load and leverage by rule of thumb. Baalbek takes those familiar patterns and turns the volume up. It stretches our sense of plausibility. But stretching is not the same as breaking. A third tool is to think in terms of evidence hierarchy. Some kinds of evidence are stronger than others. A carved dedication, in its original setting, telling you who built a structure and roughly when, is strong. A block that feels too big is not evidence in the same way. It is a prompt, an emotional reaction, a perfectly valid human response, but not by itself a reason to overturn what everything else at the site is telling us. A YouTube video that quotes another video that quotes a book that never cites its sources stands lower on that hierarchy than a peer-reviewed excavation report that records stone by stone what was found where. This doesn't mean that only specialists get to have ideas. It does suggest that when different explanations compete, the ones anchored to multiple independent lines of evidence should carry more weight. Still, that's not the end of the story. Because fringe theories do something else that's worth noticing. They remix older myths for new audiences. The idea of giants at Baalbek isn't invented by 20th century authors. It draws on much older Near Eastern traditions about powerful ancient peoples, Islamic folklore about jinn labouring under Solomon, biblical echoes of Nephilim and mighty men of old. The Atlantean angle isn't new either. It taps into a long European fascination with Plato's story of a drowned island civilization, layered over 19th century obsessions with racial hierarchies and civilization bearers. Alien narratives are the latest iteration. They emerge in the mid-20th century in a world saturated with rockets, satellites, and science fiction. Suddenly the sky is populated not just with gods and angels, but with spacecraft. Old sacred places are reinterpreted through that lens. The same stones, new scripts, television specials and popular books take bits from each stream, local legend, classical text, earlier travelogues, and weave them into something that feels fresh, even when the underlying motifs are centuries old. In that sense, Baalbek continues to be what it has always been, a canvas. Once empires projected their power onto it in columns and courtyards. Later, medieval rulers grafted fortifications onto it. Now, modern storytellers project narratives of lost wisdom, cosmic contact or forbidden technology onto the same limestone. It's tempting, in response, to swing to the opposite extreme and strip all enchantment away. To say bluntly, there is no mystery here, move along. But that would be dishonest. There are still open questions. We don't have a day-by-day account of how the Trilithon was laid. We don't have the names of the foremen, the layout of the temporary earthworks, the exact sequence in which each block was dragged, raised, bedded, and dressed. We can model plausible methods. We can point to parallels. We can test small-scale reconstructions. We cannot reconstruct every lost thought, every shouted order on that hillside 2,000 years ago. The key is to hold both truths at once, that the broad outlines of Baalbek's history are well grounded in evidence, and that within those outlines there is still room for curiosity, for careful speculation, for the quiet pleasure of not knowing every detail. Imagination, in that frame, doesn't have to fight with history. It can walk alongside it. You can lie in bed and picture teams of Roman workers straining at ropes under a hot Levantine sun, an engineer counting paces, calculating gradients. You can just as easily picture older hands before them, Phoenician or local, choosing this terrace as a sacred place long before any imperial architect arrived. You can enjoy the old stories of Jinn and giants as stories, reflections of how earlier generations tried to make sense of what they saw without needing to flatten them into literal fact. And you can listen to the modern tales of Atlanteans and aliens as another layer in that long tradition of meaning-making. Fascinating, revealing, but not binding. Because in the end, the wonder doesn't depend on visitors from the stars. The wonder is that, with stone and sweat and shared knowledge, human beings, our own species, or armed with nothing we would recognize as advanced machinery, could conceive and execute something on this scale. The real mystery is not that the stones are here, it's that the will, the coordination, the accumulated craft existed to put them here, and that their presence still nudges us gently toward questions about what people can do together and how we choose to tell the story of those achievements. From here, we can turn back to the evidence, to what archaeology and engineering can and can't yet answer about Baalbek's construction. Because between wild speculation and dry certainty, there's a more interesting middle path, a place where awe and analysis can both have a home. So let's walk that middle path for a while, not with slogans, with the pieces of the puzzle we actually have. Start with what is on the firmest ground. When archaeologists and architectural historians look at Baalbek, they don't see an isolated marvel. They see a site embedded in a very specific moment of Roman imperial expansion. Inscriptions on site name Roman emperors: Augustus, Nero, Antoninus Pius. They mark dedications, restorations, benefactions to the great sanctuary of Jupiter, Heliopolitanus. The layout of the main temple complex, the hexagonal forecourt, the grand staircases, the massive columned facade, belongs squarely to the world of Roman monumental architecture. Its decorative details, Corinthian capitals, entablature profiles, mouldings, match what we see in Syria, in Asia Minor, in Rome itself in the 1st centuries CE. Coins and ceramics from the fills and foundations line up with that same period. When you dig through the rubble and backfill, you're not finding Atlantean artifacts. You're finding Roman material culture. The masonry speaks the same language. Yeah, most of the visible podium and upper structures use techniques that are textbook Roman. Drafted margin ashlar, clamp cuttings, Lewis holes for lifting tongs, precise mortar beds in the superstructure, occasional brickwork in later repairs. The blocks may be enormous, but the way they're dressed, the way corners are worked, the way joints are finished, these all echo Roman sites in Lebanon, in Jordan, along the Syrian coast. Even the famous Trilithon wall, for all its scale, is not alien in its logic. Its lower courses, built of slightly smaller but still impressive blocks, show clear continuity with known Roman retaining walls. The upper podium extends in a way that makes structural sense given the terrace's slope and the need to buttress the temple platform. Taken together, inscriptions, stylistic parallels, datable finds, construction techniques. These lines of evidence converge on a straightforward conclusion. The vast stone platform we see today, including the Trilithon, is part of a Roman-era monumentalization of a much older sacred hill. That part of the story is not especially controversial among specialists, but as soon as you move from who to exactly how, the ground becomes softer. There are things we still don't know. We don't have a preserved construction ramp running all the way from the quarry to the temple. We can infer where it might have been from scarps, from subsurface surveys, from the logic of gradient and access. But no ancient engineer left us a sketch with a neat label. Hauling ramp, 22 meters wide, slope 8 degrees. We don't have a block in mid-transit, stuck on a prepared bed of rollers, or abandoned halfway up the slope. We have hints. At the quarry, the so-called stone of the pregnant woman lies partly undercut. Nearby, even larger blocks have been identified, still attached to the bedrock, with levelling channels and separation trenches started but never finished. Tool marks there, broad chisels, point picks, match the quarrying techniques seen on the Trilithon stones already in place. That suggests a continuous tradition. The same quarry, the same general methods, blocks getting progressively more ambitious until at some point a limit was reached and the largest pieces were left where they lay. On the temple terrace itself, careful surveys have found oddities. Cuttings in the bedrock whose purpose is debated, areas of disturbed fill that could hide remnants of temporary works, segments of wall where the bedding of gigantic blocks suggests they were slid into shallow prepared trenches rather than dropped into deep sockets. Future archaeology might firm some of this up. If, for example, a buried portion of a massive earthen ramp survives under later fill or medieval fortifications, ground-penetrating radar or electrical resistivity surveys might pick up its footprint. A long linear anomaly of denser, compacted material aligned with the quarry and the Trilithon face would be a powerful clue. Excavation at the right point on that line could, in theory, reveal wheel ruts, post holes for winch frames, or layered deposits of trampled earth and broken stone from decades of hauling traffic. Microscopic analysis of the soil might pick up crushed plant fibres consistent with ancient matting, used to reduce friction under sledges. A small thing, but part of the chain. Closer study of tool marks on the Trilithon themselves, using 3D scanning, could refine our sense of the working sequence. You might see where rough quarry faces were left, where finer dressing was done in place, where levers were inserted to shift a block that hadn't settled correctly. Datable materials are another potential line. Mortar, where it exists between courses, can sometimes be dated using radiocarbon on trapped organic particles, or by optically stimulated luminescence on quartz grains. Timber remains from scaffolding, if ever found charred or waterlogged in construction fills, could give precise felling dates. Right now, the chronology is mostly relative. We know the broad window from associated finds and stylistic comparisons. A few secure absolute dates from construction materials could pin down phases more tightly. Was the Trilithon laid early in the Augustan project, added later as an expansion, adjusted after an earthquake? The truth is, Baalbek's long life works against our desire for clarity. After the main Roman building campaign, there were centuries of use, repair, and modification. Byzantine Christian communities adapted parts of the complex. Islamic rulers fortified the platform, slicing new embrasures through old walls, building towers, reusing blocks. Each phase disturbed what lay beneath. Foundations were recut. Fills were dug into and refilled again. Earthworks that once supported ramps were dismantled or eroded, and their materials scavenged for later walls. Texts are patchy too. We have references to Heliopolis as a great sanctuary, mentions of its oracles and festivals, notes about imperial patronage. But no one in all the surviving ancient literature felt the need to document the logistics of hauling the biggest stones. Why would they? To them it was engineering, not magic. Important in practice, not in narrative. Even modern observers don't always agree on the basics. Measurements of the Trilithon blocks vary depending on where and how they're taken, and how deeply joints and weathering are accounted for. One researcher might give a figure of 750 tons, another 900, a third over 1,000, based on slightly different dimensions and assumptions about the limestone's density. These numerical disagreements don't change the overall picture. We're still talking about astoundingly heavy stones, but they do illustrate how much room for interpretation still exists, even before you get to the question of movement methods. All of this produces a particular kind of uncertainty. Not the uncertainty of total ignorance, but the uncertainty of missing steps. We know broadly who built. We know approximately when. We can sketch plausible ways they could have done it based on physics, ethnographic parallels, other ancient sites. We can't yet point to a single, unbroken chain of evidence that says, here is the quarry, here is the ramp, here are the toolkits, here is the winch anchor, here is the date. That's where interdisciplinary work becomes quietly powerful. Geologists study the quarry stone, identify its exact formation, measure its mechanical properties. That constrains the likely failure modes, the maximum safe stresses, the way blocks might have been oriented to avoid cracking under their own weight. Engineers run simulations of sledges on gradients, model how many oxen or humans would be needed to generate enough pulling force, test different friction coefficients for wood on wet clay, for fibre ropes over wooden capstans. Remote sensing specialists map subsurface anomalies, trace old channels, identify man-made terraces that don't quite fit the medieval fortress plan. Architectural historians compare fine details of the masonry with other sites, tracking the evolution of specific mouldings and joint treatments. Piece by piece, these separate lines of inquiry narrow the range of viable scenarios, and they don't produce cinema-ready certainty. They do produce more grounded possibilities. In the end, though, one question still lingers on that hillside. When the designers of Baalbek chose to commission blocks of 800, 900, maybe even 1,000 tons, when they instructed quarrymen to undercut a stone so large that it still lies, half-freed in the earth, were they pushing the outer edge of what their techniques could handle? Ambition racing ahead of practicality, daring the engineers to catch up? Or were they operating within a well-understood envelope of skills, a set of hauling and lifting methods now largely invisible to us, so that what looks reckless from a modern distance felt to them like hard work but not madness? Did ambition outpace technique, or has technique outpaced our evidence? For now, we can't say for certain. We can only lie here, in the half-light between knowledge and imagination, and let that question rest beside the stones. So let's drift back to where we started. Night on the hill, cool air moving softly along the terrace, the great platform of Baalbek rising out of the dark, its edges fading into shadow, its mass pressing down into the mountain. Those impossible-sounding numbers, 800 tons, 900 tons, maybe more, quietly sleeping in the masonry beneath your feet. From here, in the stillness, all the arguments fall away a little. The debates about aliens or lost supercivilizations, the measured responses about Roman inscriptions, quarry marks, engineering simulations, the careful maybes and probablys of archaeology. What you're left with is simpler. Humans, stone, time. At Baalbek, those all three are layered so deeply that it's easy to lose track of the scale. You have a sacred hill used long before Rome, when local gods and sky watchers shaped the first platforms and altars. You have the Roman imperial phase, loud and confident, wrapping that older sanctity in vast colonnades and gravity-defying terrace walls. You have centuries of reuse, Byzantine churches, Islamic fortifications, medieval travellers carving their names into already ancient stones, and then, finally, us, standing here with our questions. Science at its best doesn't try to crush that feeling of wonder. It just asks, what can we actually know? What can we test, compare, date, measure? For Baalbek, that gives us a strong outline. We can say with good confidence that the visible podium, the Trilithon, the Grand Temple plan had belonged to the Roman world. We can say that enormous stones can be moved with sledges, ramps, rollers, levers, capstans and patience without invoking anything supernatural. We can admit at the same time that some steps in the sequence are still missing, that there are ramps we haven't found, timbers that rotted away, work songs and rules of thumb that were never written down. Between the things we know and the things we don't, there's a space. That's where curiosity lives. Baalbek sits in that space, a place where sober scholarship and wide-eyed amazement can actually coexist. You don't have to choose between them. You can accept that Roman engineers and local craftsmen, with muscles, math and inherited know-how, were capable of astonishing feats. And you can still lie awake under those stones and feel your mind stretch, here trying to imagine the first day a gang of workers watched one of those blocks finally slide into place. You can honour the real people who did the work without draining the mystery out of the hill, because there's another mystery here too. Not just how did they move the stones, but why do we care so much? Why does a terrace in Lebanon built 2,000 years ago on top of far older sacred ground pull at us across continents and time zones? Maybe because somewhere underneath the concrete and glass of our own lives we recognise the same impulse, to gather, to build something that will outlast us, to leave a mark in stone that says, we were here, we knew the sky, we lifted heavy things together. You, listening to this, are part of that same long story. Your ancestors, thousands of generations back, survived ice, drought, famine, and near extinction. They learned to cooperate, to share knowledge, to move through hostile landscapes by talking, teaching, remembering. The masons at Baalbek inherited that. So do you. The fact that you're lying here, letting your mind wander across half the planet while you fall asleep, is one more expression of that deep, stubborn human tendency to be curious, even in the dark. If you'd like to keep wandering with me, you can. There's a whole book waiting for you about prehistoric secrets and the long, fragile thread that leads from those near-extinct ancestors all the way to us. It dives deeper into bottlenecks, migrations, forgotten technologies, and the ways our species keeps almost losing everything, and then clawing its way back. You can read more about it and pick up a copy if you like at sleepytimehistory.com. And if you want more journeys like this, more nights drifting through ruins and deep time, it truly helps if you tap like, leave a comment and subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from, and if you feel like it, what time it is there right now. A small room in a city, a quiet house in the countryside, a night shift break, a long flight, a hospital ward. I read those, and they turn this from a monologue into a map of sleeping humans all over the world. For now, though, you can let Baalbek recede. The terraces sink back into the dark. The Trilithon stones become just shapes against the sky. The questions we've traced tonight can rest where they've always rested, in the silence between those blocks, in the gaps in our knowledge, in the long patience of stone. You've walked the hill. You've listened to what we know and what we don't. You've stood for a little while with the builders and with all the wondering people who came after. Now you can set the stones down. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift away from the masonry, away from the centuries, back into your own body, your own bed, your own night. The hill will still be there in the morning. The questions will wait, and somewhere, under a sky older than any temple, you can finally sleep.